On the Zscaler Internet Access Administrative UI, to view the isolation profiles, you can navigate to Administration and Browser Isolation. On this page, you should be able to view all the isolation profiles that are created. You should be able to edit the isolation profiles. You should be able to add new isolation profiles. Also, you should be able to navigate to the isolation banner section. Let's try and add a new isolation profile by clicking on the Add Profile button. You should be able to provide a name. You should be able to turn on the turbo mode. Enabling turbo mode switches from pixel streaming to streaming of rendering commands, which is a lot more performant and provides a better user experience and is a lot more snappier. You should be able to enter a description to identify this profile. On the company settings page, you should be able to set a pack file for the isolated browser. The pack file set on the isolated browser forwards the traffic from the isolated browser to the Zscaler Internet Access service edges for processing of isolated traffic and logging. By default, the recommended pack file is selected. If you need to, you should be able to deploy your own pack file. You have the capability to override the pack file and forward the traffic from the isolated browsers to the nearest ZIA public service edge to the user rather than to the isolated container. You have the capability to enable debug mode, which assists in debugging issues related to the isolation session. The isolation browsers by default trust all major trusted root certificate authorities which are trusted by Chromium. In addition, the Zscaler root certificate is also trusted by the isolation browser. If your organization uses an SSL certificate which is signed by your own root certificate authority for the purpose of SSL inspection, you should be able to add that in here to make the isolation browser trust your custom root certificate. On the security section of the isolation profile, you would be able to define a plethora of security controls which needs to be applicable on the isolation session. You would be able to control the level of interaction that the user has with the isolated web pages. For example, you should be able to control the ability of the user to copy content from the isolated sessions onto the local computer or from the local computer onto the isolated session. Similarly, you should be able to control the user's ability to transfer files between the isolation sessions and onto the local computer or from the local computer onto the isolated containers. You should also be able to control the user's ability to print web pages and documents rendered in isolation, the ability to either pass keystrokes or not onto the isolation web pages. Also, if the user would be able to view Office files within the isolated browsers and a lot more. We will be discussing these additional options in depth as we go forward. In the regions section of the isolation profile, you should be able to select the different isolation data centers of Zscaler, which provides you the cloud browser isolation capability. It is recommended to at least select 2 of the isolation regions from the list. Whichever Zscaler data center is closest to the user out of the selected list where the user would be provided an isolation container. In the isolation experience section of the isolation profile, you would be able to select the banner which needs to be applied for that isolation session. When a user accesses a web page which needs to be isolated, a customizable banner is displayed to the user, providing him a heads up that the web page which he is accessing is being isolated, and his level of interaction with the web page would be restricted based on the configured security policies. In addition, you should also be able to configure if the user would be able to view the URL bar of the isolation browser persistently to get an understanding of the web page or the original URL of the web page which he is accessing. You should be able to configure two different isolation experience modes, one which is the native user experience mode and the other is the browser in browser experience mode. The browser in browser experience mode allows the user full access to the URL bar of the isolated browser, allowing the user to be able to enter the URL of his choice in the URL bar of the isolation browser and access the web pages of his choice from the isolation browser. You should also be able to enable watermarking and watermark isolated sessions to be able to display user IDs, timestamps, or a custom message such as confidential, which would be watermarked onto every web page which is accessed from the isolation browsers. You should also be enable cookie persistency on the isolation session. Enabling this would ensure that at the end of every isolation session, before the isolation container is discarded, the cookies from the isolation container are copied over to a secure storage, and when the same user requests for a new isolation session, the cookies are restored back to ensure user preferences are carried forward.